Welcome to another episode of Off the Menu. I'm your host, Vincent Franchini from Tumblr House, here with an incandescent Charles Coulombe.
That's it? You sound pretty subdued. Tough weekend?
What the? What's wrong with being subdued?
Nothing. It's just you're usually much more bubbly.
You want me to be more assertive?
Not
Is that what
assertive.
you want? No,
No,
I can be
assertive
less
I do
subdued.
without. I'm thinking bubbly.
I can be less subdued.
I want you to be bubbly. You know, the think back to being 12 years old and being given a new bike by your dad.
Why? I feel like you're trying to emotionally manipulate me right now. You're trying to, yeah.
Manipulate. You know, I don't try to manipulate nothing. I'm just here to spread a little understanding in a world filled with mendacity and deceit.
That's fair, I guess, most of the time.
Besides which, Mr. Smart Guy, on Monday, when people will be watching this, it'll be the legal holiday commemorating a man who never told a lie.
George Washington.
And he ate cherries when he knocked down the cherry tree with his little axe. It never happened, but it was a big story still. And when I was a kid, you always identified Washington's birthday with cherry pie. Do they still do that?
No, not really. I don't think so. Did they do it when you're young?
Yeah, they sure did. And they'd always have cherry pie specials on Washington's birthday. Because the story goes, his father, when he was a little boy, his father gave him an axe, and he took it and chopped down a cherry tree. And his father said, "Who chopped down the cherry tree?" And George said, "I cannot tell a lie, father. I chopped down the cherry tree with my little axe."
How did that originate?
Well, a fellow named Parson Weems wrote a life of General Washington, and he invented that story. And of course, it was immortalized by the famous song "Charming Billy."
You
know, "Where have you been, Billy boy, Billy boy? Where have you been, charming Billy? I have been to seek a wife. She's the apple of my life. She's a young thing and cannot leave her mother. Can she bake a cherry pie, Billy boy, Billy boy? Can she bake a cherry pie, charming Billy? She can bake a cherry pie and she'll stuff it in your eye. She's a young thing and cannot leave her mother."
Nice.
Does that make you feel better?
That makes me feel better.
Who's your favorite president?
Jimmy Carter.
Oh, I see.
No, I don't know. I liked from your characterization in Puritan's Empire. I don't know. There's some qualities. I'm really amused by the qualities in Andrew Jackson. Like some of the things he said, like when the Supreme Court was like trying to overrule him, and it's like, well, okay, you can get your army to enforce your law.
That's right. That's exactly what he said. If the Chief Justice has an army, let him enforce it.
Yeah. So I don't know who my favorite president is, to be honest. Who's your favorite president?
You mean other than Warren Harding?
Other than Warren Harding, and George Washington. I know you've taken a question, then you felt George Washington was the most Catholic president, even though not Catholic. It's like and I remember your answer was he was the closest thing to it.
No. And he gave up supreme power before he became president to retire to his farm. But other than Washington, I would say that the greatest president in the history of the United States, bar none, was probably the incredible, the extraordinary Millard Fillmore.
Now you're making fun.
All right, fine. William Henry Harrison.
Okay, now you're still making fun.
What?
Isn't that the guy who died after pneumonia or something?
Yeah, 42 days in office. He left behind a great legacy. Of the presidents I've lived under, Reagan was my favorite, but look at what he had to contend with in terms of competition for that role.
What about Teddy Roosevelt?
I like Teddy. I like Teddy a lot better than Franklin.
There you go. All right.
How do you feel about Teddy?
I like some of the things he did. Didn't he carve out all those trails? He did a lot of things for national parks, I thought, right?
He sure did. He sure did. And he personally carved his own face on Mount Rushmore.
Really?
No.
Oh, okay. That would be wow. That would be something.
You remember whose faces are on Mount Rushmore?
Gosh, I'm trying to remember based on what is it? Is it Vertigo, the Alfred Hitchcock movie, where the final scene is they're on the top? I can't remember.
Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, and Harding.
I feel like this is a multiple choice, and the question is, name which one doesn't fit.
I love Harding, and one of our patrons, I think, sent me a note this past week in which he pointed out that there's a new biography of Harding out.
You gonna read it?
Yeah, I probably will. I mean, it's either that or watch Dancing Rabbis.
Yeah, that's true. Not a lot of options out there.
Not really. Which of the two would you do? Would you read Harding's life, or would you watch the Dancing Rabbis?
I would read Harding's life.
Really? Anti-Semitic, huh? See, what I would do is I would read Harding's life during the commercial breaks.
You would.
And then I'd watch the Dancing Rabbis the rest of the time. Did it ever occur to you that Dancing Rabbis need love too?
Okay. So what else is on the calendar? So you said it's Carnival season.
It is Carnival season. Tomorrow, Sunday, is Sexagesima Sunday, which is the midway point in Carnival. Well, almost. Because next Sunday, a week from tomorrow, is Quinquagesima Sunday. Now, tomorrow is also Meat Fair Sunday for our Byzantine friends. So tomorrow is the last day they're supposed to eat meat. They wean themselves off during the week. Then next Sunday, Quinquagesima for us is Cheese Fair for them. And Lent begins with Monday. But with us, we get Monday and Tuesday as Lundi and Mardi Gras. The penultimate days, the penultimate and last day of Carnival. And then you really got to party hardy until the stroke of midnight on Ash Wednesday. Lent begins. So you going to New Orleans for Mardi Gras this year?
No, I won't be going to New Orleans. I've never gone to New Orleans.
That's sad. Your brother and I did one year.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, it's one of your favorite places, right?
It sure is. And we had a good time that year. It was really good. Yeah. What did you do for Chinese New Year?
Let's see. I watched, we sat down and we watched some Hallmark rom-coms, and we had some pasta.
That's it?
What did you do?
What do you think I do? I light firecrackers. I dance in the street. I go in the dragon procession here in Trumau.
Okay.
We have a big Chinese community here, you know.
Yeah, in Trumau. Yep.
Yeah. Well, the problem is they all live in Baden, so we have to. If you really, my favorite Chinese restaurant in the area, believe it or not, is what do you call it?
Panda Express?
No, Shinjun. But it's a beautiful, beautiful restaurant, like the old Chinese restaurants of my childhood. Very ornate interior, and the food is really, really good.
There is a restaurant in Arcadia. I always have to laugh when I drive by it. The name is spelled Lao, and then new word XI, and then noodles. What a tragic name. Oh,
yeah,
is it? I thought it's Lousy. I thought
it'd be... lousy noodles. I wouldn't eat them.
It's a fatal flaw that business can never be successful.
I would say that was a mistake on their part. But,
I thought Chinese are very big on similar sounding things too. I'm surprised that happened, but
well, yeah, they're pretty wild. But I'm very fond of Chinese food. One thing I do miss, as you know, Arcadia is heavily Chinese these days.
Yeah,
and I kind of miss that. I mean, we have Chinese restaurants, but you know, you don't have the Autumn Moon Festival and the moon cakes. You don't have the Chinese New Year. It's not like Alhambra or San Gabriel or somewhere like that.
Yeah.
So I miss all that.
Yeah, that's understandable.
Do you miss it?
I don't miss it because I'm still there.
Oh, I knew that.
All right. On to the questions. No memes this week.
No memes?
No memes.
No memes?
It's okay. It's okay.
Nobody sent you any memes this week?
Yeah, some people send some stuff now and again, but I'm pretty strict on my meme intake. Only the best memes for Tumblr House.
Oh, even though they're not nationalized.
That's right.
All right. Fine. Let's be that way.
Yes. All right. First question is from Superfan Anita, who has a very good question. She says, "Good evening, gentlemen. Happy Septuagesimontide. I would like to get back a little to the roots of Off the Menu and ask you a couple of current event questions. Even though I run the risk that by the time you are able to answer them, they may be overtaken by events. First questions have to do with the freedom convoys and massive demonstrations in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. One of the most fascinating segments in the history of the show was Charles's discussion of reserve powers and instances when these have been invoked. When the dominions are governed by morons that are willing to completely blow up their countries rather than even entertain the reasonable demands of their citizens, isn't it high time somebody invoked some reserve powers somewhere? When is the point reached where things are dire enough for this to become a realistic possibility?
Well, ideally, that point would have been reached a long time ago, or in Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. The problem, however, the fatal flaw in the system is that whereas originally the governors general were foreign, that is to say, they were not natives of the country, originally they were chosen on the advice of the British government. But after 1926 and the so-called Imperial Conference of that year, erected into law by the Statute of Westminster in 1931, the governors general are chosen by the monarch on the advice of the local government. Now, the problem with that is that that's basically having the regulator chosen by the person to be regulated. And so in practice, in a lot of places, the viceregal residence becomes a sort of retirement home for washed up politicians. And they rarely they'll rarely act as watchdogs because they owe their position to the government anyway. I think a much better expression of the system, but this would require a great change in various things, would be if the Queen appointed whom she chose as Governor General without reference to the government. Because again, the Governor General is supposed to be, or the Lieutenant Governor in the Canadian provinces, Governor in the Australian states, is ultimately the last watchdog on the politicians. So having the politicians appoint him is crazy. Now, of course, the argument is that the politicians represent the people. You see, that's the problem. Everybody believes that. So do the royals, for that matter. And as we've learned, we knew before if we were aware, but if the past 2 years have proved nothing to us, nothing else, they are that the political class do not represent the people. They represent themselves, which makes sense. Who else would they represent? Well, I could vote. I could vote. Yeah, you could vote. That's nice. Stay in your house, wear a mask. So, as I say, for the system to work at its best, you would need for the sovereign to be an independent agency and not dependent on the politicians, and that would be true in Britain. And said sovereign would have to have a free hand in appointing governors general to the Commonwealth realms. And then at that point, it would be up to the politicians in London and the different capitals to justify whatever they did to the sovereign. But there's another way. In those countries, every bill that's passed requires the royal assent. Now, wouldn't it be better if, to get anything passed, they had to actually prove to the sovereign or the governor general that this bill was worth passing?
That'd be interesting.
Well, our president has the veto, you say. And in law, so does the Queen and her governors general. But in practice, no sovereign in Britain has ever vetoed anything since 1708. And it's been very rare in the very rare in the dominions, the more so since the Statute of Westminster, because it used to be occasionally the British government would not like something a parliament passed overseas, so the governor or the governor general would either refuse royal assent, or he would do something called reserving the bill for the Queen's pleasure or the King's pleasure, which literally meant for the government's pleasure in London. And they would decide if they wanted it to come into effect. And in most, if not all, Commonwealth realms today, those powers still are listed as the Governor General, but they're in practice never used.
I see. All right.
But certainly, we see over the past 2 years, and not just in Commonwealth countries, the need for some supreme check and balance on the rulership, on the masters. Someone could tell Governor Newsom to wear a mask when he parties his blues away at the French Laundry.
What would happen if royal assent was not given?
Well, then, if it's not given, if it weren't, then the bill would not pass, like a veto here.
I mean, what would happen to the person who didn't give it?
Traditionally, it would usually ruin them politically. When a governor or governor general exercises the reserve powers in any way, usually it's a nuclear option. That's why when the scumbag Gough Whitlam was fired by the governor general in Australia in 1975, it ruined the governor general.
Yes, I remember that. That's a very powerful story. But what about, so doesn't the Queen have to assent too?
Well, the Queen, they call it the royal assent, but it's the Governor General or the Lieutenant Governor of the Governor that actually does it. The Queen only directly assents to bills in the British Parliament or in the colonial parliaments, colonies like Gibraltar.
I'm trying to ask basically what happens if the monarch gets more proactive and there are these mechanisms which are in the government which aren't used.
In all likelihood, there'd be a real good chance you'd have a republic. Because the scummy, worthless scumbags that run the show would not like that. I mean, you've got to basically think of them as the cream of the bottom, the real worthless pieces of garbage that float to the top.
But what I'm trying to say is, why doesn't the monarch ever take that option? Like, aren't they above it all? I mean, what can they truly be subjected to?
It would provoke a constitutional crisis. And
what is that? So what? What is that to the monarch?
Well, the problem is that if in the current setup, you would be in all likelihood have the monarch overthrown and replaced with a republic.
Wow. It's hard to imagine.
It's hard to imagine until it happens. I mean, I'm sitting here in a country whose monarchy was the most stable in Europe for centuries. And then the combination of the World War and American pressure ended it.
I mean, like, could that really happen to Great Britain? I mean, the monarchy is they're such a cultural figurehead, though.
I know, but it could still happen. You got to remember that politicians tend to be short-sighted pieces of garbage, and they don't care. They don't care what they wreck.
I still I like to think that the power of the pulpit. If the monarch ever like put a microphone, in front of his or her mouth, like,
you would like to think that, but again, the system has worked the way it works for a very long time, and they're trained childhood that that's not their role. I mean, I remember when Charlie Gard was murdered by the British government, and tons of people got upset at the Queen for not. You remember there were two little kids. One was Charlie Gard. I forget the other one, and they could have been saved, but the British courts banned their going to the continent and getting whatever.
Oh, right.
So tons of people complain, why didn't the Queen do something? Well, she's not in a position to do anything. I mean, it's the way that system works, and it has some very deep flaws. And one of them is that it's a crown republic more than a monarchy. I mean, I don't know if you saw it, but I put out on Facebook accompanying pictures of Charles I, James II, and George III. It said the vast majority of the inhabitants of the Anglosphere think that the defeats of these three men brought them their current liberties, whereas in fact the truth is the opposite. The defeats of those three kings brought about the system of disguised tyranny under which we live. And has always been waiting there because let's put it this way. Even our system, our quote-unquote democratic system, was dependent upon the leadership showing some restraint. In other words, it only works if the masses don't realize they're owned. And that is to say that every politician is evil. I mean, there are obviously some high-minded. But you've got two different things. One is the good of the people. The other is the self-interest of the political class. And in our setup, the quote-unquote democratic setup, it works best when those two are identical. In other words, the self-interest of the political class is the same as the majority. So under that sort of a setup, our political class will not punish or abuse large segments of the population pointlessly. And they won't appear, let's put it this way, the more delicate their use of power, the more powerful they really are able to be. But when they become openly, obviously dictatorial, they show their hand. And yet the very health of the system depends on that not being obvious. Just as the powerlessness of the crown, it's essential for the well-being of the country for that not to be obvious. When it becomes obvious, then you've got several very difficult questions. One is, well, what's the good of the monarchy if it can't do anything for the sake of its people? The second, however, is by what right then do these political people rule? By what right is their government? We come down to some pretty fundamental questions which are not really answerable within the context of the present day.
All right.
I mean, if you look at the amount of disruption that all of our lives have been put through these past 2 years, that could only be warranted. It can only work if the vast majority of people, and this is a sense in which there really is something called democracy. No government actually could function without the consent of the vast majority of the governed. I don't mean that as an important right or something people should have. It's just the way it is. Unless the vast majority of your subjects give you at least grudging acceptance, you can't function. That's why any government has to be careful in how it handles its subjects. Now, with us, as I say, the invisible nature of power was very, very important to maintain the regime we had. But now everybody knows that they exist by the gift of their rulers. But by what right do those rulers rule? It's not the grace of God. They certainly don't believe in that. If it's the will of the people, well, do the majority of the people really want to be locked up and masked? And then you could say, well, it's only an emergency. Well, yeah, but who makes that decision?
Well, maybe that's how propaganda relating to fear comes in.
Of course it does. It gets people very, very, very upset. And that's why, one of the reasons why a fearful population, like an ignorant one, are easier to rule.
Yeah.
And the trick is, how long can we keep the emergency going before people get tired of it? Hermann Oberth was a famous German scientist, had a model he called, I think it was the tiger effect or something. But basically, the story was that if you set a tiger loose on the streets of Manhattan, the first week or two, everybody would hide out indoors. But as time went by and they got used to living this way, they realize the tiger is only going to kill and eat one person a day. There are millions of people in New York. So even with the man-eating tiger on the streets, the likelihood of your getting eaten by this thing is literally 1 in millions. And so after a while, the people would start coming out of their houses again. And then, every day the tiger would kill and eat somebody, and people would shrug and say, that's too bad, so sad, and go on with their lives.
Was that, what was that metaphor? What was the purpose of that for COVID?
No, long predated COVID. It's to show that people get used to living with things. And as the fear wears off, they just accommodate themselves. So that eventually, in the case of COVID, eventually people would tire, even if the death toll had been a lot higher. People would eventually tire of the restrictions, and they'd have to be lifted.
I see. So this is a statement on basic human nature.
Yeah.
I see. Okay.
Don't we want something funnier than that?
No, we have another serious question coming up, Charles. Sorry.
Oh, great. All right.
All right. Anita with another. She says a second set of questions has to do with the saber rattling over Ukraine. Charles, please discuss the historical background behind Russia's claims with respect to Ukraine. Does America have a legitimate interest in interfering, or is our potential involvement just a distraction from the president's domestic disasters?
Well, that's a good question. Let's first look at Ukraine itself. Well, firstly, you've got to bear in mind that the three major Eastern Slavic peoples, the Russians, the Ukrainians, the Belarusians, are different from one another because they all stemmed from what was called Kievan Rus, the Russia that was the capital of which was Kiev. Where they diverged was in who ran them on the outside. When the Tatars took Kiev, that destroyed Kievan Rus. Those of its subjects who lived under Mongol rule, under Tatar rule, became the Russians, the Great Russians. Those who were dominated by the Poles became the Ukrainians. Those who were dominated by the Lithuanians became the Belarusians. They're closely related. They have a lot in common, but they're far from identical. And in Russia, just to make this even more complicated for you, in 1586, most of the Orthodox in what was then the Kingdom of Poland, including the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, reunited with Rome. And this was the so-called Unia, from which we get the Ukrainian and Ruthenian Rite Catholics. But their part of Poland was absorbed by Russia during the three partitions, and in 1831, Tsar Nicholas I forcibly reunited them to the Russian Orthodox Church. So all this stuff built a lot of resentment. As far as the Orthodox are concerned, the Eastern Catholics had been stolen from them and had to be restored to their loving arms. As far as the Catholics were concerned, it was the opposite. But that played into the formation of a Ukrainian nationality. Now they existed, they were Ukrainians, but their national consciousness, like that of so many other little nationalities in Europe, really arose in the 19th century with the growth of Romanticism. All right. Ukrainian national identity grew under the Tsars, and when the Russian Empire collapsed, they made a bid for independence, and they got it for a short while. They fought the Russians, they fought the Poles, they were defeated. A chunk of the Ukrainian people lived under the Austrians as a result of the partitions of Poland, and they, to this day, they had the freest expression of Ukrainian culture, etc. The rest of the country was under the Russians, and they were subjected at different times to Russifying pushes. And the linguistic boundary between the Russians and the Ukrainians was kind of wonky. In the 1920s, Stalin, in an attempt to show the freedom of communism, created the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. And he added to it some Russian-speaking areas in the east to keep them locked to Russia. And then in the 1950s, Khrushchev added to it by adding Crimea to Ukraine. So when Ukraine became independent after the fall of the Soviet Union, Those boundaries, which were kind of artificial and intended to keep them, as I say, locked up with Russia, really could only be maintained if Ukraine was strictly neutral. Now, initially that wasn't a problem because the West and Russia were allies in a real sense. But as Obama pursued this horrible Cold War notion with Russia, starting not with Syria, not with Ukraine, but with the anti-gay proselytization bill in 2013, that is when our relationship with Russia really soured. So this, especially if it goes to war, you could say that this will probably be the first war in the history of mankind fought for gay rights. So, fly that rainbow flag proudly. Anyhow, the Ukraine had one government overthrown that was considered too pro-Russian. In response, the Russians nicked Crimea, which has not primarily Ukrainian population, very mixed. And right now they seem to be agitating to take the eastern part of Ukraine, the furthest eastern part. And they might even want to take over someplace like Odessa, the Ukrainian coast. But if that should happen, I don't see there be any way to keep whatever's left of Ukraine from gravitating completely into the West, to NATO and the EU. But if they go that route, they're going to lose territory. Now, are we justified in intervening? The problem is we've created the situation. And that's something nobody wants to talk about. The only way our intervention could be useful is if we figure a way to defuse the issue. At a start, it would probably be a good thing not to be involved in a Cold War with Russia in the first place. That would probably be smart. Cold Wars are very, very difficult to prevent from turning into hot wars. And war with Russia would benefit no one.
All right. Question from Chicago Jacobite. I wanted to make a witty comment first, but as perhaps only Chicago Jacobite in captivity, the subject is too serious.
That's true.
I get that feeling in the gut that comes from being sick with disgust almost every time I read or see performed almost anything about Prince Charles Edward Stuart. He is much too often portrayed as a self-serving nitwit, often by people who should and maybe do know better. Would Charles give us his take on the prince and his life?
Yeah, very happily. Well, basically, we mentioned earlier in the podcast about the way the British monarchy's powers were gutted. That didn't happen overnight. The first big process was the so-called English Civil War, the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, in England, Scotland, and Ireland. The king was murdered. Oliver Cromwell ruled the country for 10 years. Then he died. His son wasn't much good at it. And so the Republican regime was overthrown with what was called the Restoration. And Charles II, the son of the murdered king, became king. His brother converts to Catholicism. And when he succeeds his brother on the throne, James II, the oligarchs bring over William of Orange to replace him in the first successful invasion of England since 1066. James's followers are called Jacobites, after Jacobus. And they fight in England and lose, then Scotland and lose, then Ireland and lose. And the so-called hybrid form of government that the Brits have today was begun with the so-called sovereignty of Parliament. which of course in those days meant the sovereignty of the oligarchy, and today means the sovereignty of the political class. The Jacobites didn't simply want to restore the House of Stuart, though they obviously want to do that. Religiously, they tended to be either High Church, Anglican, or Catholic. They wanted an effective monarch in all three kingdoms, but they also wanted local liberties, which is why in 1707, when England and Scotland united their parliaments and it became the United Kingdom of Great Britain, as opposed to the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of Scotland under the same king, the Jacobites opposed the union. And when James II died in 1701, his son became James III. And there were a couple of attempts, notably 1715, 1719, to restore him to the throne. Both failed. And the decades went by. He and his family were forced to leave France, where James II had gone. They took up residence in Rome. James III married a Polish princess who became his queen, Klementyna Sobieska, and in turn gave him two sons. The older was Prince Charles, the younger was Prince Henry. Well, the older very early joined the French army and was on various campaigns as, an observer. But he was bound and determined to restore his father to his throne. And in 1745, the War of Austrian Succession, the French came up with the idea of really pushing regime change in Britain. That would have changed things tremendously. Unfortunately, they put together an expedition to help Prince Charles regain his kingdom. But there's storms, various other things, and the French aid never came. But the prince landed in Scotland with 7 men, the 7 men of Mordred. And he immediately contacted a local clan chief, who didn't think it was a great idea challenging the government with nothing. But Prince Charles said, "Here I am." And he raised the standard of rebellion, as it were, the standard of restoration, if you will, and rallied the Highlands to his cause, invaded the lowlands, took Edinburgh, although he was never able to take Edinburgh Castle. But he held court at Holyrood, the way his grandfather and great-grandmother and so on had done. It was an amazing, audacious move. There was an army, a government army outside Edinburgh, much bigger than his forces. But he looked, and this is key, I think, to understanding him. He realized that there were marshes on one side of the government camp. And he realized that while he didn't have the numbers necessary to engage them head on, he thought, if we can get through those swamps, we can surprise them. And then they said, well, they're impassable. Nobody can get through them. But he saw sheep grazing. And he said, no, there's a shepherd out there who knows the way through the swamp. Find him. We'll take the way through the swamp. We'll attack them in the morning, and we'll win. Well, they did. And that was just an amazing victory, the Battle of Prestonpans. So they moved south and decided to march into England to retake the crown. However, the English Jacobites did not join them in huge numbers. And as the further south they moved, the more restive his lieutenants became. They got as far south as a town called Derby. There's a straight shot open to Oxford and then London. And what they didn't know was that the German Elector of Hanover, George II, was packing and getting ready to return because he thought he was about to lose. The London mob was pro-Jacobite. But the prince's associates, his top men, did not want to push on to London. They had picked up a double agent who claimed that there was a big army in the way, but there wasn't. They figured the best thing to do was to retreat to Scotland and, carry on the fight from there. The prince said, no, no, no. We march on to Oxford and then London, and then we win. But we've got to do it quickly. Well, they overruled him. And they began the long march back to Scotland. And the fight went on to the prince. And as we know with 2020 hindsight, he was right and they were wrong. Mind you, their reasons for being wrong made perfect sense at the time. But they were wrong. And the day after they left, Derby, a messenger came from Sir Watkin Williams Wynne in Wales, offered to raise Wales, which had the prince either been there or just left on the road to Oxford, would inevitably have happened. Now, had they succeeded in taking London, it would have been very, very different. There still would have been government armies roaming around, but with London firmly in the hands of the king, the king's forces. They would have had the Bank of England. They would have had the means of paying troops. And it's hard to say what would have happened, but it would have been interesting. And then his father would have come over and reassumed the throne. And the history of the world, including our colonies, would have been very different. Better or worse, no way of knowing, but it would have been different. But that terrible defeat broke him. They marched all the way back into Scotland. At the end, they were defeated at the Battle of Culloden, and that was the cause dissolved. My own multiple great grandfather, Lachlan Mackinnon, returned to the Isle of Egg, from whence he had come, leaving 2 brothers dead on the battlefield. And the prince went into hiding. Heavy price on his head. But he went from place to place, drinking. He became quite the drunk after this time. And finally making it to the Isle of Skye, and then rescued by a French ship and brought back. From that time on, his father would not see him. So he never saw his father again after 1745. The joke about him was that he had a glorious future behind him. In 1756, there was a plot to restore him to the throne, the so-called Ellendale plot, and he secretly visited England and was received into the Church of England. The idea being that more people would support him if he were Anglican. It didn't work. In the meantime, his younger brother, he didn't get married because he didn't have many prospects. His younger brother became a priest and then a cardinal, Cardinal York, the Cardinal Duke of York. And in 1766, James III died. Now, up to this point, the Holy See had recognized James III as King of England, Scotland, and Ireland. But when he died, the Pope of the day, Clement XIII, recognized George III as king. And when Charles III, as Prince Charles was now, came to Rome, where the family property was and all that, it was made clear by the Pope that he was not to be received as a sovereign. And in fact, he visited the English, Scots, and 2 Irish colleges in Rome. All 4 of their rectors received him as king with royal honors, and all 4 got fired by the Pope straight away. So he was very disappointed. For the remaining 22 years of his life, he sunk deeper and deeper in drink and despair. He did get married, but his wife walked out on him. And about 3 years before, 6 years, 7 years before he died, he received a deputation from the Continental Congress in the United States, who were fighting the Revolution, offering him the crown of America, which he refused. Had he accepted it, who knows what would have happened, but he was in terrible health by then. He died in 1788. His brother, Cardinal York, then claimed the throne as Henry IX. But Henry IX, being a cardinal, had no children. And the French Revolution broke out, and all of his property was seized by the invading French in the 1790s. So George III granted him a pension. And he died in 1807. And he and his brother and father were interred together in the Vatican in St. Peter's. And both their tomb and the big monument to them in the body of the church were paid for by George IV, who loved Sir Walter Scott's novels and had become quite a fan of things Stuart. He was George IV, who had some drawbacks to his character, nevertheless made himself very popular in Scotland and Ireland as the first sovereign to visit those countries since James. So what do I think of Prince Charles Edward Stuart, Charles III of England, Scotland, and Ireland? A great opportunity lost. A man who did his very best in incredibly challenging conditions, and who was a far better man than many of his critics.
Okay.
He had a resemblance to Blessed Emperor Charles, not in the way he dealt with defeat, which was very poorly, but like the late emperor, he had a tremendously good intuition as to what ought to be done.
Yeah, that's what my mind drifted to as you were going through this tragedy of his defeat. There's a lot of similarities there.
Yeah, there were. The biggest difference being that Blessed Emperor Charles dealt with defeat much better than Prince Charles did. But of course, he didn't last long, whereas Prince Charles Edward Stuart lived a very long time, 42 years after his defeat. What do you do for an encore, you know? And it's interesting. It was his brother who reconciled him to the church and took care of him in his last years.
All right.
Interestingly enough, too, there's a family of Polish nobility that claimed illegitimate descent from Prince Charles. One of their ancestresses supposedly having had a kid by him. And they did the DNA. And you know what they found out?
What?
It's true.
All right.
So he still has direct descendants today, but of course, because they're illegitimate, they've not got no claim to the throne.
Okay. Question from French guy number 1. He says, I love the Slavic liturgy. Particularly, I very much enjoy the Old Rite and the Russian Orthodox Church utilized by the Old Believers. Could you also talk a bit about the history of the Old Believers? I also discovered, much to my surprise, that there were several groups of Old Believers who unified with Rome. How did it occur that Old Believers reunited with Rome? And are there any left? If so, does Charles know of any Old Believer Russian congregations that still exist today?
Well, yeah. Basically, back in the 1500s, there was a reforming patriarch of Moscow who over many years, a number of Russian liturgical customs and all that had developed on their own and become rather different to the way things were done in Constantinople by the Greeks. So this patriarch decided to update and Greekify, if you will, the Russian liturgy. The old believers would not accept the changes, and they became very heavily persecuted, in fact. And then they split into two groups: the priestless and the ones with priests. The ones with the priests and bishops carried on a sort of parallel Russian Orthodox Church down to the present day. Those who did not keep the clergy, who stopped believing in the priesthood, developed into a weird set of sects. The Kiltsi, the Skoptsi, who believed in self-castration. The Molokhan, who only drank milk. They wouldn't drink booze. The Doukhobor, who worship in the nude. I mean, they had all. They went into as many weird ways as you can imagine. All of these, whether with priests or without, were persecuted by the Russian government with greater or lesser severity down in 1905. Now, in the late 1890s, a movement toward reunion with Rome developed amongst Russian Orthodox believers. And after the Byzantine Catholic Church became legal in Russia in 1905, it grew pretty quickly. And some of their priests made contact with Russian old believer groups who had also become legal. And some of these came into communion with Rome. In Oregon, then you have the Russian Revolution. All this, the kibosh was put on. But you had Russian Catholic refugees in Europe and America. These were not necessarily old believers, but you have 4 Russian Catholic parishes in the United States. In New York, in San Francisco, in Denver, and in the glittering metropolis of El Segundo. But in Oregon, you had a massive group of old believers come in a town called Woodburn. And for a long time, until they got people of their own, the local Catholic monastery looked after them. And so a number of them came into communion with the church and remain. There's also a settlement of old believers, Russian old believers in Alaska, which, as you remember, was a Russian colony. And it's interesting that when Alexander Solzhenitsyn left Russia, the first place he moved was this old believer village in Alaska.
Okay. Final question for this episode is from a person with the moniker Dramatic Dodo.
Ooh.
Yeah. He says, I am a university student in the Midlands, England at the moment, and soon the Papal Nuncio to the United Kingdom will be visiting the university for Mass, after which there will be a Q&A. The same university Charles may be visiting soon. As a Latin Mass attending Catholic, what would be some good and difficult questions to ask him?
Well, several. Why has Pope Francis put us in the position of having to choose between him and Benedict? Over the Mass. Secondly, what's it like knowing that in suppressing the Latin Mass in the west of England, the Church has repeated Henry VIII's suppression of the Benedictines in Glastonbury? What's it like being a successor of King Henry? I'm just curious. Also, what does one say to the Chinese Catholics who the Pope betrayed by turning them over to the communists? Is there anything wrong with that? I mean, is betrayal a bad thing? I'm not saying it is. Maybe it's right delivering souls to Satan. That could be a good thing, maybe. Who am I to judge? But the question is, since this Pope is constantly going on about how everybody's in the church, even if you renounce your baptism and all that, why should anyone care about his penalties and excommunications? In other words, on the one hand, with one mouth, or whatever orifice he talks out of, he's punishing the traditionalists. They're bad. Hurt them. But with the other mouth, he says everybody's okay. So why should we care what he thinks? Why should his penalties mean anything? Basically, if with one mouth he's going to say everything's okay, but the other mouth says, but not you, what are we supposed to think of him?
What do you think he'll respond?
Oh, I'm sure he'll moonwalk away from the question, lots of words, or he'll get angry. Who are you to talk to me this way?
Yeah, that usually is how it goes. You know, there isn't a real conversation because there can't be a real conversation. Everyone just sort of accepts madness. It's like,
well, yeah, and they don't have to care. That's the important thing to bear in mind.
That's what I noticed about the vast majority of priests and just the clergy is you don't pick a fight and you don't question, you just do it, and it doesn't matter what it is, honestly.
No.
You know?
Not at all.
How does that happen?
Habit. I mean, look, you get used to things.
Because you said what I'm just reminded myself of is it's like when you were telling us about the reserve powers.
Yeah.
And then, you know, my question was, why doesn't the monarch do something? And you said, well, they've been trained their whole lives to not do anything.
Yeah.
So is there something like that with the clergy, whether it's in the seminaries or?
Yeah, very similar. I mean, look at the crap we take just after 2 years. People can be trained like dogs. And they are. There's a difference, between training and education.
I call it programming.
Well, it's as good as any, sure. You know, we bark when the bell rings and food is given to us. We're trained. So, I mean, stop and think about it for a second. On the one hand, there's the question of objective truth. How do you justify this in the light of truth? The other is you're getting your 3 squares a day and your nice salary and a home to live in by going along. Now, we are so constituted that we can't really say that to ourselves usually. Most people cannot look themselves in the mirror and say, I'm a sellout. Yeah. I'm a sellout because, I much rather enjoy what I've got than go through any trouble. So I'm just selling out. Very, very few people can actually look themselves in the face and say that. So we are masters at self-justification. I'm going along for the greater good. I've got all sorts of reasons, really good reasons for selling out. But of course, I don't call it selling out. I'm being realistic. It's only an expedient. Well, look, I've got a wife and kids. All kinds of good reasons for it. if I don't go along with this, I'll lose my position, whether I'm a pastor or the king. And then something worse is going to happen, which is very often true.
The sad thing is, really, our state of life and state of comfort, we do things that people 100 years ago can't even dream. You're in Austria, I'm in California.
Yeah.
And I've got machines that are conditioning the air right now. I've got a cup of coffee, maybe a donut today. And so, I mean, what really is uncomfortable, what would be uncomfortable for us today would still be kingly 100 years ago, more than kingly. You know what I mean?
Beyond kingly.
Beyond kingly.
I mean, stop and think about this. When your ancestors and mine came to the New World, that was a life sentence.
That's very true.
For most people, I mean, there were folks who went back and forth, but they usually either worked for the government or they had a lot of money. For most people, when you crossed that water, you never went home again. And now, I'm sitting in Austria, you're sitting in the States. I am home as we speak. That very room that you're sitting in, I have been in many, many times down through the years. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Until on COVID and the attack of the weenies, I mean, even now, if I were willing to go through the hassle, I could hop on a plane and be in LA by the end of this time tomorrow.
It's true.
That's just amazing to me. I'm going to be able to go to Madeira in the middle of the Atlantic and celebrate the Emperor's Centennial on April 1st. That's just bizarre. When I was a boy, even, having a pen pal in Europe was a big deal. Getting a letter from France or England or whatever. Wow. Now we practically live in each other's laps. During the great lockdown, it amused me that thanks to Zoom, I have actually seen a lot more of a number of my friends scattered around the world over the past 2 years than I did before.
Yeah.
If we can't actually get our bodies, which is easy enough, from one end of the world to the other, then we have this thing. And I can remember when I was a boy in LA, Visiphones were a thing of the science fiction future. Now the future is now.
Oh. Anyhow, a lot of interesting. My mind is going in like a million different directions right now.
Well, that's good. I hope our audience has the same feeling. As we're getting ready to go into Lent, next week will be the Mardi Gras show. So, dun, 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 dun. I'm going to have a line of dancers behind me. Like Carnival in Rio.
Yeah, take a picture.
Well, they'll be just off screen.
Oh, okay.
They'll actually be behind. You can't see the fourth wall, but they'll be behind you,
of course,
dancing. For my private viewing pleasure, while we're doing the show, I'll have this whole row of carnival dancers keeping me busy. But no, it's a wonderful time to be alive, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, there's challenges and everything's annoying. It's always the case. I suppose I'm feeling kind of ebullient because I did have a very good time last night. Met some very interesting people, and it was good. I really probably shouldn't have had all that, Jen. I'd have felt better this morning, that's for sure. But it was a good time. It was great to get out. On March the 5th, we're being restored to something approaching humanity here. I have a suspicion today, or rather yesterday, was the deadline for the government of Austria to present its legal justifications to answer the questions that the Constitutional Court asked last week. I don't know that they did.
Does it matter?
It matters a lot, because you remember the mandatory vaccination law? The Constitutional, what's that?
Well, is it a question of the Supreme Court is going to use their army to enforce it? Is it like one of those things?
No, things have changed since Jackson's day.
Good.
And they're not, let's see.
Okay, so let's say they don't meet the deadline. Then what happens for you?
Well, what happens is that apparently they didn't do it. Well, it would violate the law. I mean, it would not violate. It would presumably end the law. You know, the court, the questions that the court asked were very searching. I'll tell you what they were. I don't know, honestly. I don't know that the government can answer them, but if they don't answer them, then the law is going to be voided. But if they do, here's the thing. 31 January. Explosive questions. Court demands data from Austrian Health Ministry justifying COVID-19 rule. It says Austria's powerful constitutional court has demanded detailed data from the country's health ministry justifying the government's corona response. The 14-member court issued 10 sets of questions to the health ministry on January 26th in order to prepare for a possible oral hearing into a number of complaints it has received against Austria's COVID-19 measures. The health ministry has until February 18th to respond. Well, the questions: what is the effect of the lockdown for the unvaccinated on the hospital burden expressed in percentages? The court is interested in whether there was ever a threat of the health system being overloaded, which is the only scenario that would justify a lockdown. The letter began by citing a media report from October of last year, which stated that, as an example, patients in intensive care due to kidney failure who happened to test positive for COVID-19 would count as corona cases. The Constitutional Court therefore requests information as to whether the hospitalization or death numbers given include all persons infected with SARS-CoV-19 who are hospitalized in normal or intensive care units, or who have died of or with COVID. If so, why was this method of counting chosen? They asked for information about which the virus variants were associated with the numbers, a breakdown by age cohort, and for percentage allocation, outlining where infections occurred, such as family, work, shopping, or leisure activities. Another question: by what factor does wearing the mask indoors or outdoors reduce the risk of infection or transmission? In other words, not it does, but by what factor? How does it do it? What percentage? It says by what factor does COVID vaccination reduce the risk of severe disease? Again, they want numbers. Data on the efficacy of the vaccines, reducing severe illness, preventing transmission, durability of production. And then it says, in media reports, there was talk of up to 95%. Now the general risk of dying from COVID, not differentiated by health or age status, currently appears to be 0.1516%. What does the stated vaccination efficacy of, for example, 95% refer to? What do absolute and relative risk reduction mean in this context? It also asked, what's that?
This reminds me of your Papal Nuncio Q&A.
Well, yeah. Yeah. And I mean, this thing, the date came and went, and apparently there was no response made to it.
That's a nice little system you guys got there, where the government has to actually answer to someone.
Well, that's it goes back to the king or the electorate. You know, the problem with our current system is that for the most part they don't have to answer to anybody. And here, you do have this constitutional court. Now, my suspicion of the timing of the lifting of the restrictions, March 5th, is so that everybody will be so overjoyed at having lives again that this will all go away.
Okay.
The alternative for them to answer those questions would be to prove, they have to prove that what they did was effective. And what if it wasn't? Well, 2 years of misery for nothing.
Wow. Wait, can we like have some court in the United States do some of that and like send some questions and make people enter questions and then like get government people in difficult positions? Can we do that over here? Is there some way?
Well, you could. You got the Supremes. Diana Ross could convene them in Washington.
I gotta get me some of that.
Yeah, we need us a constitution, you know. But no, seriously, it is an interesting thing, and so my guess is that the COVID regime is going to fade. Now, the problem, of course, in Canada is that the people push the government, and they don't like that, especially when you've got the little baby Justin, little tiny Justina, who he kicks his toys when he gets upset. I much as I loathed his father, I cannot stand little Justine. Every time I look at him, I want to take a shower with Brillo pads. He's a disgusting human being. What's that?
Not that you're
not
judging.
That that's a bad thing.
Yeah.
I don't judge.
Yeah.
I just accept. But anyhow, remember, ladies and gentlemen, history is filled with this stuff. And as long as the world goes on, we'll have difficulties and problems. And it's remember the comforting song I sang some weeks ago.
Yeah.
It'll be all the same, just the same, 100 years from now. No use worrying, no use hurrying, no use kicking up a row. For I won't be here, and you won't be here when 100 years have gone. And somebody else will be wheeling the cart, and the world will still go on.
There we go. That's good. That's a nice way to close the show, with a nice, happy song.
Does that make you feel better?
That makes me feel a lot better.
There are other nice, happy songs like that.
No, that's good enough for now.
You know what? Happy Days Are Here Again?
Happy Days Are Here Again is nice.
Mindless optimism. That's what I'm into. It's all wonderful, everybody. It's great. It couldn't be better. It's all tremendous. You know the secret to life?
What?
And I'm going to share it to you. I learned it actually from a really bad playwright called Christopher Durang. But he shared this. And I think I'm going to pass it on to our beloved audience.
Just whisper it to us. Yeah. What's the meaning of life?
The secret of life is keep breathing. What?
That was anticlimactic.
That was my antebellum sister.
All right, well, we'll keep breathing. There we go.
I think of antisocial, too.
All right, that's going to do it for this episode, everyone. Thank you for watching. If you'd like to become a patron, you can do so for as low as $5 a month. Get your questions asked, get early access, and get access to the pre-show.
Be the first on your block.
That's right. All right, so...
operators are standing by.
Yeah. But what
Some
about...
assembly required.
What about if it's Monday, though?
Then my suspicion is that it's quite likely to be Washington's birthday. But no, if it's Monday, it's off the menu.
What about the soul you save?
It could very well be your own. And, stay sane out there, ladies and gentlemen. A lot of people going cray-cray. Don't you be one of them.